Donkey Kong is an icon of gaming that never really got the respect he deserved. Originally he started 2 iconic games, but was then shelved in favour of that carpenter who kidnapped him. He was a more marketable character after all. And even with Donkey Kong's 3rd game, various Game & Watches, his son appearing as a racer in Super Mario Kart, and a very enhanced remake of his first ever game, our gorilla friend never overtook Plumber Boy. Until the mid-90s truly hit, then everyone played it loud with this trilogy of console masterpieces, and the trilogy of Game Boy games too, before he followed Wrinkly Kong's lead and suddenly died. Although technically this isn't the same Donkey Kong from the first few games, the branding is what lived on and died. Donkey Kong was one of Nintendo's best franchises, and it was the face of the company for a little bit. Donkey Kong and Nintendo were inseparable to the public. But before I discuss today's topic, Donkey Kong Country Returns 3D, I think it's only fair to look at the most important games that established what Donkey Kong was, and what it was that Retro Studios had to make a sequel to. Donkey Kong Country 1 is such an ambitious title, and this isn't really appreciated nowadays. Not only were the graphics unparalleled for the time, which was obviously the biggest selling point, but the actual world design and the lore was a step above the other platformers of the era. This was the most believable world full of talking gorillas and crocodilians I have ever seen. Everything was contextualized, and the music helped sell the atmosphere even better than the graphics did. Oh yeah, and the game was just really fun, well, most of the time. A large variety of levels that would become staples in later entries, multiple animal buddies that would make certain levels memorable, and the way the duo themselves worked really separated it from its other platforming competition. You could switch between either of the 2 playable characters, Donkey and Diddy, and there would be a lot of good reasons to do so. Even if Diddy Kong was superior in almost every instance, but if one Kong was injured, you'd lose them. Each Kong had 1 hit point, so at most the duo could have 2. It was a great game that ended with a showdown with one of the coolest villains of the era. He's a big old round boy and he's my friend. This monumental title was followed by Donkey Kong Land, and okay, generally speaking it's a pretty bad game. It was made even worse with the original hardware since you couldn't actually see the graphics very well on that tiny Game Boy screen. But for all the complaints I have against it, it was creative and memorable with ideas that weren't revisited in the series ever again. It really felt like an entirely different entity from its predecessor, and for that alone it's worth a play, even if it's not really a fun game. Plus once you get to the end you get to see K. Rool, he's all tiny and cute, I love it. But really the most interesting part of Donkey Kong Land is the story, so I hope you kept your instruction manual from 1995. The sequels to Land specifically feel more like their sister games, so they're not worth dissecting in detail, but what they lack in originality they more than make up for in playability and fun factor. Land 2 and 3 are great games, even if they're just aping the original Country 2 and 3 with little to separate themselves. Donkey Kong Country 2 is such a phenomenal improvement over Country 1. The level variety is so much better, the challenges are much more memorable, and we replace the titular character with someone way cooler, Dixie Kong. That being said, the game is a little more cartoony than its more down-to-earth predecessor, but it's not that bad, it's not like he's in space or anything. We have more creative level designs here, and they are just impractical and unrealistic. But who cares, they're fun and memorable. I love Kremland, and I like spooky ghost levels. They're less naturalistic and believable than Country 1, but they're much better than Country 1's more comparatively drab aesthetic. And oh yeah, the best part of Country 2? The animal buddies serve a much bigger role. They're not just simply something you ride on and lose them if you're hit. We play as the animal for complete sections, and they have entirely different movesets. They feel nothing like the Kongs. It's great. And then take out all the colours and you have Donkey Kong Land 2. Donkey Kong Country 3 is the most controversial of the trilogy, but it's personally my favourite. We trade Diddy Kong for Kiddy Kong, which is admittedly much worse, but the level design feels more refined here and the animal buddies get even more fun challenges dedicated to them. Every game needs an LEV elephant level. We have less of the levels I don't really like here. They've been traded in for other levels that still have their own gimmicks but feel much more like fun platforming stages. This game is just very well paced, and we have a hub world which is a joy to explore. Oh yeah, and we have the Brothers Bear here. You can't forget Bramble Bear, he is the best brother bear. The cartoony dial has been cranked up even further in Country 3, and I don't really like whatever this thing is, its face kinda creeps me out. And then once again take this game, remove the color and hub exploration, and put in one more Brothers Bear and we have Donkey Kong Land 3. And then repeat that entire sentence, don't remove the color, and then you have the Game Boy Color remake, which was only available in Japan. But hey, I like my land games being very hard to see, thank you very much, I don't need all this fancy color. This is what Donkey Kong was during its heyday. From 1994 to 1997, we had these great games. The franchise burnt fast and bright. He ruled the mid-90s with some of the best platformers available, then he took a back seat. He had one 64-bit game, he had ports of his old games, there were some spin-offs, some games built around bongo controllers that regardless of their quality, weren't winning over the same hardcore audience who were too busy plotting out how It's Mr. Pants is tied to the Donkey Kong universe. We had 3 games pushing the SNES, each a masterpiece in their own right. We had 3 games pushing the Game Boy, 2 of them being really great platformers of the era. And that was basically it, other than those remakes I mentioned earlier. The most substantial new content we had were additional bosses and an additional Brothers Bear and remakes. Donkey Kong Country remained a relic for over a decade. The way the series was in 1997 is how it looked in 2009. But in 2010, the series returned in glorious style. We finally got the much needed 4th title in the Donkey Kong Country series. It was unbelievable, and it was done by an entirely new team since the original developers were busy with Microsoft. Instead of the classic British sensibilities of Rare, we had retro studios from the United States, fresh off the Metroid Prime trilogy. This was their first ever platformer and it had big shoes to fill, and it mostly filled those expectations. Emphasis on mostly. The biggest problem with Donkey Kong Country Returns is Retro Studios made a sequel called Tropical Freeze, and that gets much more attention, well-deserved attention, but it does hog the spotlight nonetheless. To a lot of people, Returns is just the other one, and it's easy to see why when it's not as readily available in modern systems like the other 4 games. All 5 DKC games are great, but its Return, the most important game in the series sans the first, is the one most people gloss over. I know I did. I grew up with the Country and Land trilogies, and I gave up on Nintendo during the Wii in its later years. I was a teenager, I thought I was too cool for these colourful and fun games. I dived back into Nintendo with the Wii U and I bought Tropical Freeze, and I bought it again for Switch. I first explored Returns after having already beaten Tropical Freeze. This was the last game in the series I actually beat, so this was a goodbye to me, not a return. But the title is apt because I have returned. This is not my first rodeo. Returns debuted on the Wii, and it was beautiful there. Definitely making the most of that ancient hardware thanks to great art direction and technical know-how. And if we boost the game's resolution, we can see just how timeless these visuals are. They haven't aged a day, and you can see it in its best with an emulator. But that's not really how I like my games. So to cater to me specifically, this game was somehow crammed onto a 3DS, which was pretty much the only gaming system of the last decade that made the Wii look like a powerhouse. Yet despite that, Returns on 3DS still looks beautiful. Well, from a distance. Sure, it looks worse, and it runs at a lower frame rate, but is that it? Back in my day when we wanted portable Donkey Kong, we had to settle. We had barely visible games, take it or leave it. But very little is compromised here in Donkey Kong Country Returns 3D. This is basically the same game as the Wii version, but it controls better and has a little extra content at the expense of all that pretty stuff. This is still a Wii game on the go, but it's a Wii game on the go from 2013. It being a bit worse for wear wasn't a big compromise to me then, and it isn't now either. Plus, the 3D effect is a really nice way to justify that downside, and it works well here. It's not amazing, it's a bit more on the subtle side, but certain effects that flew towards the screen work so much better here, and it feels like the game was originally designed with this. Not surprisingly, Donkey Kong Country Returns stars Donkey Kong. Well, actually that is kind of surprising considering 2/3 of the previous games only had him in minor supporting roles. He wasn't playable in 2 or 3. As a DKC 4, this does fail the immediate task of sidelining the titular character, but I honestly couldn't imagine it any other way. It would be kind of insulting if after this long-awaited return to a dead franchise, everything just continued and the game starred Kiddy Kong and some freshly introduced character to play second banana. For better and worse, this is a very vanilla experience when compared to earlier entries. The things that always changed previously kind of stay the same here, and the one constant of the franchise, the Kremlings, didn't even get an invite. We traded in those crocodilians for the Tiki Tak tribe, who do win the award for lamest antagonist of the series, but unlike some fans, I'm mostly happy they injected new life here. Kremlings are cool, but they don't need to be the only major antagonist. The only real issue here is the execution, since the Tiki Tak tribe aren't compelling, and their designs aren't super memorable, so to me they're lesser than the Kremlings of before. Returns is a soft reboot of sorts. It does still technically continue from earlier games, but there's no knowledge of those required here. We're back at square one, and in some ways we're even further behind that, because this isn't the same kind of game as before. It plays almost nothing like the actual Country series. Instead of playing as two Kongs in tandem and switching the lead whenever we feel like it or get hurt, we're always Donkey Kong here. He's all we get to play as. However, things aren't as stagnant as they might seem, because Diddy Kong does still show up, just in a much lesser role. DK barrels litter the levels, and once you smash it open, Diddy Kong pops out to assist his hero. Diddy's main role is just to use his jetpack to keep the duo airborne a little longer, which is very appreciated help. And something almost as helpful is he also doubles our health bar. When we're on our own, Donkey Kong dies after taking damage twice, whereas this duo can take up to 4 hits. Although this functions more as each Kong having 2 hit points, so once Diddy is used as a shield after 2 hits, we're back to DK and his 2-point health bar. The duo just revert back once they hit too much. Not only can we damage boost now and get a better jump, but when we have the duo together, they can roll through levels with unparalleled speed and fluidity. Donkey Kong's speed isn't nearly as fast when he's on his own, and because of his fragility, you generally have to play a little more carefully as for Kong on his own. But hey, at least it gives us a chance to use the blowing ability. It's there, he blows air from his mouth, and that's about it. It's usually there to find secrets, more on that later. But for standard play, it's an inclusion I'm still pretty neutral on. I don't mind it being here, it doesn't really detract much either. The sequel replaces it with something cooler looking and quicker, but the fundamental problem of stopping or starting is here regardless of which action it is. Blowing does have some cool gimmicks. It can be used to blow the fog away from this one level. I like that. Oh yeah, and it can also blow out fire, but why would I stop and do that when I could just run and jump over all these obstacles? But hey, kudos to them for at least thinking of logical results for this weird feature. But whenever we're not stopping to use the blow ability, this is a very fast-paced platformer with deceptively brutal level design. This platformer for the Wii, with an even more cartoony style than its predecessors, is significantly harder than them, and that's with our health being doubled as well. Things do start off pretty comfortably, but this isn't the kind of game that only ramps up towards the very end or even post-game. Things get hairier than the Kongs themselves within no time. And that's especially the case with the people that insist on getting all 4 Kong letters per level. These are deviously placed MacGuffins that are usually only accessible by doing an optional harder platforming challenge instead of taking a safer route. Collecting these does turn out to be important later, and these are the kind of obstacles we can't just get and die immediately after. You need to safely get to a checkpoint to save that collectible progress, and since landing safely is harder than just brute forcing it, this was the right approach, but this at times is where most of the frustration can come from. To make it even worse, the original Wii version was generally harder to play, which is a shame since it was most people's introduction to this game. The rolling ability, which is something you need to do all the time and the game is built around it, was only controllable by shaking the Wiimote. You can get used to it, and some people never had issues with it at all, but it's still a needless barrier to many, and this is especially the case for people with various disabilities or injuries that can't do constant shaking. This same action was mapped to a button in the 3DS release, and nothing was lost from it. Some games are built around control schemes that seem confusing at first, but become second nature after enough time, and shows us the player that there's more to game design than just playing it safe. But Returns wasn't that. It was a generic platformer with a single, often repeated action that wasn't as reliable to execute as it would have been with a button press. But wait, let's rewind. I did say generic. I don't mean that in any kind of bad sense, because this is anything but boring, predictable, and all those other adjectives that probably came to mind. Donkey Kong Country Returns is one of the most imaginative platformers of the era, but it is still chained down to aping only the most marketable and memorable aspects of the series. Sure, this is Donkey and Diddy only, the entire setting is DK Island only, and we're missing some of the more creative locales or mechanics, but what we do with all those individual parts is second to none. Okay, second to none except its sequel? No. Okay, it's third to none except the sequel and the other successor to the Donkey Kong Country trilogy. This game has been overshadowed since, but even with some fierce competition, Returns proves itself and is still among the most consistently enjoyable and creative platformers ever made, and I'd say it even outdoes its predecessors, but with some animal body shaped holes that is. Every single level here feels truly distinct, even when we're in the same world or use similar aesthetics. They are all built around memorable set pieces or gimmicks that complement everything and don't take control away, and it does things that could not have been replicated on the SNES. Waves will crash in from the background, the environment will collapse, and a wall of hungry spiders will chase you, which actually made me scream loudly when I first saw this, and that wasn't some kind of cute kid moment. I was still an adult when I first played this game. But seriously, Retro, why do you do this? The older DK games had cuter spiders. In fact, the level before this had some too, but this just triggers my fight or flight response and I hate it. And that's only the second scariest moment. The game jump scares you if you don't punch a boss quickly enough after defeating them. But everything in this game is much more fluid, and DK will do cool things like hang from ledges or ceilings coated green, which adds so much to this formula. Previously, the Kongs would just hang off ropes and vines, or be stuck to some honey-coated walls, but those can't hold a candle to this. Every part of these levels is fully utilised, and we'll be swapping between rolling on the ground to traversing the ceiling with ease. On top of that, depth is utilised here for some moments where we jump between the foreground and background, so I can officially put this game in the same genre as Wario Land Virtual Boy and Mutant Mudds. And like those two, this works best when you have it on 3D and it's popping right at you. The best part of this entire feature is it gave us a neat level in Smash Bros. For Wii U, and all these fancy mechanics are put to the best use in the minecart levels, and boy do they put the old ones to shame. Whether they were actual minecarts, roller coasters or toboggans, each of the previous country games had these speedy, auto-moving levels where you had to time your reactions perfectly. They were fun and evolved with each game, but the peak of creativity was basically outrunning a ghost in 2, or quickly switching between floor and ceiling in 3, and that was basically it. The Super Nintendo obviously couldn't do super bombastic stuff. The computers rendering it would have all exploded if they had to factor in things like bending or exploding. But the Wii, and in this case 3DS, have no such issues with this, and these levels are full of surprises and aren't afraid of taking you off the actual tracks with impromptu replacements that only barely make sense. But it all flows so expertly, and these minecart sections are probably the best the game ever gets, since it's all fast paced all the time. It pushes me to wanting to perfect everything as I die over and over and over. On the other side of this, for rocket barrels. Okay, I like these a lot. In Tropical Freeze. Here I don't. They are similar to minecarts as they're auto-scrolling sections that are only controlled by pressing a button. In this case, it's a button to move up, and when you press nothing they fall back down. There's a delay to it as well, which is certainly deliberate, and it feels good to master. But I never have enough control over it, which is a shame, since we have to deal with obstacles from pretty much every single possible direction. What makes them unforgivable, however, is any collision is instant one-hit kills. This turns what could have been a neat challenge into my least favourite moments of a game, easily, and this is single-handedly the best change Tropical Freeze added, as the rocket barrel is no longer a one-hit kill in that game. Like sure, Tropical Freeze has more Kongs to use, more original level themes, better enemies and so on, but none of those compares to having tolerable rocket barrels. Whenever we're not in some kind of vehicle, the generous health system does ease the difficulty a bit, but not as much as you'd expect and sometimes want. This is still a brutally tough game, and if you respawn nowhere near a Diddy Kong barrel, this can be bleak. But at least those barrels are usually placed in good locations, but sadly usually does not mean always. Whenever you die too many times, this game's tutorial pig will show up and offer you a solution, which is basically just to watch the gameplay itself. This is a bit of an overcorrection and it feels a little condescending. I feel like a system where you're given a free Diddy barrel after repeated failing would have been a much better way of assisting those that needed help mid-level. That being said, there are some difficulty modifiers, which is a great option, since this cartoon game basically made for kids is the type of game that is definitely not actually made for kids. With the in-game collectible coins, we can visit Crinky's shop, which stocks a large selection of items ranging from lives, which is basically all I ever went to him for, to items that give DK temporary invincibility, or an extra heart to get for a level with a bit less hair pulling. But don't expect those to fix the rocket barrels. We can also purchase the service of Squawks, the animal buddy from before, and he can help us find puzzle pieces if you need help finding them. The puzzle pieces themselves are basically another collectible, but these are found in much more puzzling parts of a level, rather than something that's tricky to platform. At their best, these are rewards for getting to an area you wouldn't think to get to, like behind a wall or on top of something that doesn't initially seem like it'd be accessible, although usually they're just given out for repetitive bonus stages that do wear out their welcome and are much worse than what came before, but at least they do change their aesthetic as you progress through the game, so there's that I guess. And at their worst, the puzzle pieces make up the worst portion of the game, stopping every few seconds to blow on something in case a puzzle piece is found there, and while they usually aren't, they sometimes are, so test everything. These sections go against the quick nature of the game, so much so it honestly ruins the game if you focus on these. So don't. They can be fun to find on occasion, but don't spend your first playthrough of levels looking for these. They're simply not worth it. This is something you begrudgingly do on repeat playthroughs of stages if you have a compulsion to 100%. But wait a second, earlier I said Squawks was here. That's a shame, he was such an iconic animal buddy of before, and it's a shame he's not properly playable. Oh well, that's okay. Squawks was honestly one of my least favourites, so maybe it's for the best. I'm sure they only brought back the best animal buddies. Oh wait, they only gave us Rambi. Rambi is definitely the most iconic buddy, and he's been transplanted really well here. He's this unstoppable powerhouse that blasts through levels and breaks everything in his way. This is Rambi at his best, but why only him? He was always one of the less interesting buddies, but that might actually be the exact reason why they only picked him. A lot of the other buddies have a lot more uniqueness in their movesets, and utility that would require a different set of level designs than what Retro did here. I don't want to slight Retro, they made an amazing game with fast-paced levels, but maybe that's all they wanted to make or felt comfortable making. Rambi is basically just a faster Donkey Kong that breaks walls. Buddies like Squawks, Squitter, and Ellie require different level design approaches, and I can forgive their absence given what we have here. But Rattly, he was my friend, and he will be missed. Just make the same levels but taller, and then I can have Rattly again, okay? The other speedy boy who would fit alongside Rambi was On Guard the Swordfish, who made water levels a blast before. but it would be awkward to invite him here since we have no swimming. It's pretty strange. These were iconic parts of a country and land series. Before 2010 I couldn't imagine the series without swimming, but since swimming was usually some of the weaker parts of the older games, I can once again see this as them trimming the fat to focus on what worked best. And that's generally how I see DKC Returns. This isn't just everything from before, it's a precise reinterpretation of the best bits of before without any of the lulls. It doesn't always achieve that, but I don't miss the lack of swimming, for example. And while I do miss the animal buddies, I'm glad they have more of what the game does best. No extra animal buddies is better than poorly implemented animal buddies at least, so maybe they played it safe. The game's musical selection also fits this theme, since it's basically just a best-of compilation of old music from the series. And while I do like these songs, which sound even better than ever given the remixes, it really is a shame there's very little new music here. Back in my day we got 2 separate original soundtracks for DKC 3, here we barely get an original soundtrack. But hey, what is here is still good. You can't go wrong with the classics. The new enemies are anything but classic. The primary antagonist here, as I mentioned earlier, is the Tiki Tak tribe, a set of basically sentient musical instruments, and they're kind of just there. They do nothing for me, but they did hypnotize other animals on DK Island, which is where the enemy roster does improve. They're still not amazing, but I do love cute animals, and the more cartoony aesthetic Retro went for really does shine here. Just look at those sharks, I just want to hug them. The enemies keep being swapped out depending on the world we're in as well, and the specific themes of the levels, which does help keep everything from getting too repetitive. Like obviously the crabs will make an appearance on the beach, but not in the factory. And my favourite, these little dinosaur skeleton things, I love them, and they do show off some of Retro's creativity. This whole game takes place on DK Island, which is playing it safe. And some of the world themes also feel very safe. We have jungles, caves, ruins, and forests, for example. These aren't all just copied. Even things like the factory, which is technically an old DKC theme, has an entirely different feel here, and it is very hard to compare to the grey look of Creme Croc Industries. I can't even make a comparison to the generically named cliff levels here, full of these dinosaur skeletons that have been reanimated and tar falling through the level. This is the best example of Retro's ability to be creative and add to the series' lore with this game. The worst edition of this, however, is the tutorial pig. We don't talk about him. The only pigs I want to see here are the ones from Donkey Kong Land. Another thing that feels like a bit of a blunder is the bosses. I like some of them as fights, and even the ones I'm not all on board with aren't bad by any means, even if they do drag on a little. They're serviceable, even if the timing on the final boss's last hit is a lot stricter than I would expect. The bosses are generally just animals hypnotized by the Tiki Taks, and I'll be honest, I love Mugly and Thugly even if I have no idea what they're meant to be, with the exception of them and whatever that caterpillar thing is. These are all basically standard animals, at least by DKC standards. I can accept moles throwing pickaxes, and I could even try to excuse it by saying it's a reference to Donkey Kong Land. But the chicken piling the giant bipedal mech is kind of where I draw the line. Or at least I thought that would be the worst thing I'd see here, but no, the game's ending would surprise me by being the most ridiculous thing ever. It simultaneously amazed and disappointed me. Back in my day, the Donkey Kong Country games were realistic. We had a rideable spider with 8 sneakers, and we had banana birds. A lot of what I have said applies to the Wii release too, and that makes sense since this is a very faithful port. But we shouldn't discount the additions here either. Not only do we have the 3D on all the time, including the chunky cutscenes which I love being downscaled this much, but we have 2 important additions, even if one of them is something the majority will scoff at. A new difficulty mode was added to the game, and it makes it a much easier experience. The first difference you'd notice is just the amount of hearts DK has been slightly increased, but the real difference here is the economy. The items you purchase are cheaper, there's more of them, and items can be stacked so you can have multiple equipped at once. And it also returns to the player if they're not expended during said level. And things like the invincibility item will still work after dying in a level, as the item originally vanished if the player fell down a pit for instance, even if they had more uses available. This is a game that looks appealing to children and frankly adults who aren't platforming veterans. It's colourful and just fun to watch, so I'm glad there's a way they can actually play the game without having to rely on Super Kong. That way the players still get the satisfaction of playing without as much frustration. This whole mode is a nice precursor to Funky mode, even if it is less bodacious. And on the topic of ways to play, we have 2 different control schemes here, which is better than one, even if full customization would have been preferable. Those who can only play with a D-pad are catered to here, and scum like me that find the circle pad sufficient can continue to be wrong and use the default configuration. But most importantly, the 3DS release adds an entire extra world after completing every other level in the game, including the already secretive temple stages, which require finding every single Kong letter in the game. The original Wii release had 1 bonus level, that one's still here, but we have 8 preceding it now, and these are some of the strongest levels in the game, which is even more surprising since these weren't made by Retro, they were instead made by Monster Games, the company that ported this to the 3DS. I know they didn't have to do as much work as Retro since they weren't making whole new assets. This is basically made with pre-existing world themes, but the level design is still great here, and I feel like they don't get enough credit. I really wish they got to make more, or even make a whole kind of Donkey Kong Land type game, where we just get to reuse everything with fresh designs. Oh yeah, and there's also a co-op mode here, but it only works with 2 separate but local 3DSs, each with their own copy of the game. No download play here. So yeah, I'm not going to be able to play that anytime soon. Donkey Kong Country Returns 3D is exactly what it says on the tin. It's Donkey Kong Country, and it's returned, and it's now in 3D because of the 3DS. Sure, not everything returned, and the game's tone isn't congruent with what came before. This isn't what I wanted or expected from a 4th Donkey Kong Country game, but it is no doubt a 4th Donkey Kong Country game, and it's still just really fun, even when my brain tries to rationalize the bits I don't like. To a whole new generation, this is what Donkey Kong Country was and perhaps still is. And while it's been replaced by better games, it's no less worthy of your time. Pretty much everything I wanted them to add was added with Tropical Freeze or even Ukulele in the Impossible Lair, except for Rattly, I still miss him. But Donkey Kong Country Returns is a game that people should still play, even if it's not the best in the series. It's still a fundamental game that needs to be played by more people, and you may as well play the 3DS version since it has better controls, more levels, an easier mode for people that want it, and it looks worse, which I kind of like. Seeing them cram a Wii game onto such a weak system is genuinely kind of amazing.